The cool marble of the preparation slab chilled the air around you. Before you lay the body of the pharaoh's great royal wife, not as a revered ancestor to be guided gently into the field of reeds, but as a vessel for a command that turned your stomach. You were a royal embalmer, a Hetem W. Netja, a sealer of the god, trained in the sacred, meticulous 70-day ritual of mummification, a process woven from equal parts science, faith, and profound respect for the eternal Ka. Every linen strip, every amulet, every incantation from the Book of the Dead had a purpose: to preserve the body, Ka, so the soul could recognize it, to protect the deceased in the duat, and to ensure a harmonious afterlife. It was a covenant with the gods and the dead. This assignment shattered that covenant. The orders, delivered in hushed tones by a high priest whose eyes would not meet yours, demanded deviations from the Wesek, the sacred, traditional procedure. Specific organs, normally treated with reverence and stored in canopic jars under the protection of the four sons of Horus, were to be discarded. Amulets of protection were to be omitted from the linen wrappings. Most disturbingly, you were instructed to prepare the body in a ritual pose, not of peaceful rest, but one associated with a specific, rarely invoked funerary spell meant to bind the spirit to a duty, not release it to paradise. The reason whispered alongside the orders was not one of state secrecy or dynastic politics. It was a matter of fear. The pharaoh, it was said, needed his wife's presence and influence secured in the afterlife for reasons that spoke of dynastic instability and cosmic anxiety. Her journey was not to be one of liberation, but of eternal service. Your life's work, your sacred knowledge, was being weaponized for a purpose that felt less like honoring the gods and more like attempting to control them. This scenario, while fictionalized, points to a profound and often unsettling truth about ancient Egypt that moves beyond the glittering gold and imposing pyramids. Our modern understanding, heavily filtered through centuries of interpretation and, crucially, through the moral and social lenses of the archaeologists who first uncovered this civilization, is inherently incomplete. The Victorian era, which saw the explosive growth of Egyptology, was simultaneously fascinated and horrified by what it found. Confronted with a culture whose imagery, texts, and practices openly engaged with aspects of life, sexuality, the human body, ritual intoxication, that their own society shrouded in strict taboo, many pioneers of the field made a conscious choice to curate, to omit, and sometimes to destroy. Between approximately 3003 CE and 30 BCE, along the fertile banks of the Nile, Egyptian civilization developed a complex worldview where the boundaries between the divine, the royal, the natural, and the human body were fluid and deeply interconnected. In this worldview, the pharaoh was not merely a political ruler. He was the living incarnation of Horus, the divine link between the gods and people. His physical and ritual health, his Ma'at cosmic order, directly influenced the Nile's flood, the harvest's bounty, and the kingdom's stability. This created an immense, ritualized pressure where the pharaoh's potency, in every sense, was a matter of national security. This ideology extended into a concept where life force energy encompassing sexual energy was seen as a potent, divine force. It could be harnessed, channeled, and used in rituals aimed at regeneration, protection, and maintaining cosmic balance. To the Egyptian mind, a religious ritual, an act of procreation, and a spell for agricultural fertility could operate on parallel symbolic principles. This is not to say ancient Egypt was a society of unchecked libertinism. Far from it. It had strict social codes, marriage laws, and notions of propriety. However, its ritual and symbolic language could be startlingly explicit by later standards, using the imagery of creation and life force in ways that Victorian scholars found embarrassing and indecorous. The evidence for this broader, more integrated understanding of life and ritual comes from sources that have often been marginalized: fragmentary papyri dealing with medicine and magic, certain temple reliefs in less visited areas, votive objects, and even the careful forensic study of mummies themselves. When 19th century excavators like Giovanni Battista Belzoni or Auguste Mariette encountered explicit sexual imagery in tombs, they often documented it poorly, hid it, or in some cases, defaced it. Papyri with sexual content were labeled erotic and sequestered in private collections or museum storage, their magical or medical contexts ignored. This act of scholarly curation created the sanitized Egypt we inherited, a civilization of majestic gods, noble pharaohs, and pious funeral rites, with its vibrant, complex, and sometimes uncomfortable physicality stripped away. The reality was a society where the human body, in life and death, was a map of the cosmos. Rituals involving the body, including those we might classify as sexual or medical, were integral to maintaining the balance of the universe. To understand ancient Egypt is to grapple with this holistic, and to modern minds often challenging, integration of the physical and the spiritual. The ember of a troubling discovery began to glow not in a tomb's treasure chamber, but under the clinical lights of an examination room in 1925. Howard Carter's team, conducting the first detailed anatomical study of the mummy of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, noted something peculiar, then disturbing. The king's genitalia were absent. This wasn't the typical damage of tomb robbers or the ravages of decay. The removal appeared careful, precise, and deliberate, a part of the mummification process itself. This was not an isolated case. As forensic Egyptology advanced, similar evidence emerged from other royal and elite mummies, signs of genital modification, alterations, or careful removal. An unnamed prince from the 18th dynasty showed evidence that such a procedure might have occurred peri-mortem, around the time of death. These findings cast a new, stark light on obscure passages in funerary texts. References to making the deceased perfect for the afterlife or preparing the body for eternal service took on a potentially literal, physical dimension. Was this a form of ritual, neutering for the afterlife, a means of transcending earthly gender to achieve a purer spiritual state? A protective measure against specific dangers in the duat? The implications are profound. They suggest that the Egyptian journey to immortality could involve a physical transformation beyond the evisceration and desiccation of mummification, a transformation that modern sensibilities and earlier archaeologists found too confronting to acknowledge. This systematic modification of the most intimate parts of the body after death forces us to ask difficult questions about the culture that practiced it. It reveals a mindset where the physical self was utterly malleable in service to eternity, where no aspect of human existence was too personal to be excluded from ritual intervention. The Victorian cover-up, therefore, was not just about hiding obscene art, it was about suppressing an entire dimension of Egyptian thought concerning the body, identity, and the afterlife. They hid the evidence not because it was indecent, but because it was too radically different, too challenging to their own compartmentalized views of religion, morality, and the human form. The story of ancient Egypt is not just one of gold and gods, but also of flesh, ritual, and a cosmos sustained by practices we are only beginning to understand. The Egyptian sexual cosmology was not about personal liberty, but about cosmic responsibility. Life force energy, known as Heka, permeated everything. The act of creation itself was depicted in divine terms, the god Atum bringing forth the first deities through a solitary, creative act. Thus, human procreative power was a microcosm of divine creative power. This belief systematized intimacy into a framework of sacred duty and social control, creating a hierarchy as rigid as the political one. At the zenith stood the pharaoh, the bull of his mother. His ritual potency was not a private matter but a public, state concern. The famous Hebsed festival, held after 30 years of a pharaoh's reign, was a ritual rejuvenation designed to prove his continued physical and divine vigor, often involving symbolic runs and ceremonies that affirmed his life-giving force. His multiple wives and consorts were not merely a harem for pleasure, but a necessary institution to manifest his divine fertility and secure the dynasty. His role in temple rituals, which could include symbolic marriage to goddesses like Hathor, was believed to directly channel life force to the land, ensuring the Nile's flood and the kingdom's prosperity. Failure in the form of famine, military defeat, or infertility could be interpreted as a failure of this divine potency, leading to immense ritual pressure. Beneath the pharaoh, the nobility and priesthood operated within this same symbolic system. Their wealth and status allowed them to commission tombs filled with imagery of abundance, including scenes of intimate life, which were not merely depictions of pleasure, but potent spells for regeneration in the afterlife. However, the darker implications of this ideology fell most heavily on those at the bottom of the social pyramid: servants, slaves, and particularly children dedicated to temple service. Temples were not just places of prayer, they were immense economic and administrative centers, homes to thousands of personnel. Among them were the Hemu-Netja, servants of the god, which included chantresses, musicians, and dancers often associated with the cult of Hathor, goddess of love, music, and fertility. Some children, from elite or destitute families, were dedicated to temple service from a young age. While much of this service involved legitimate religious training, music, and ritual performance, the historical and archaeological record hints at a vulnerable underclass. Medical papyri, such as the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, show advanced knowledge of female anatomy and contraception, suggesting a society where managing fertility was a practical concern, potentially for women in roles outside traditional marriage. Legal documents like marriage contracts and wills show women had significant rights, but other fragments allude to a world of servitude and dependency. The story in the Westcar Papyrus of a priest's wife engaging with a commoner, while a tale, reflects societal anxieties about temple women. The systematic abuse suggested in the original script is a dramatic exaggeration, but it stems from a kernel of troubling reality. In any vast, hierarchical, pre-modern institution where absolute power exists, whether of a god-king, a priestly caste, or a master over slaves, the potential for exploitation is baked into the system. Children in servitude, whether in a palace, a wealthy household, or a temple precinct, were utterly dependent and had little legal recourse. To imagine that all temple children were subjected to ritualized sexual training is a vast overstatement not supported by mainstream Egyptology. However, to imagine that none were ever exploited within a system that ritualized life force and power would be naive. The tragedy lies in the mundane horror of institutional vulnerability, not in a conspiratorial, religiously mandated industry of abuse. The economic dimension was real. Slavery and servitude were facts of Egyptian life. People could become slaves through debt, war, or birth. A child slave was a commodity, and their value in probate lists was indeed calculated. Their bodies were not their own. While Egyptian law had provisions for certain rights, the fundamental power imbalance meant protection was fragile. The psychological impact of such a life, of being property, of potential exploitation, would undoubtedly have been traumatic, leaving scars invisible to archaeology but legible in the universal human experience of powerlessness. This system was justified and maintained by a religious doctrine that positioned the pharaoh and the temple as the essential conduits of Ma'at. If the pharaoh's ritual actions kept the cosmos in balance, then the social hierarchy that supported him was also part of that sacred order. Challenging one's place was not just rebellion, it was cosmic disorder. Thus, a priest, a noble, or even a skilled embalmer could see their role, however fraught, as a sacred duty upholding the universe. The slave or servant, in their suffering, might be told their service contributed to this great balance. A powerful tool for social control found in many civilizations. The real dark side of Egyptian cosmic sexuality, therefore, was not necessarily in widespread grotesque rituals, but in the way its ideology could sanctify a rigid social order where the powerful had divinely sanctioned access to the bodies and labor of the powerless. It normalized a hierarchy where the life force of the weak was a resource to be managed by the strong for the supposed good of all. This is a subtler, more historically credible, and in many ways more universally disturbing truth than tales of mandated orgies. It reflects a pattern seen across human history where religion and ideology are used to codify and justify inequality and exploitation. The tension between this idealized cosmic order and the messy reality of human nature inevitably boiled over. Nowhere was this release valve more explicit, chaotic, and culturally significant than in the Festival of Drunkenness, a ritual that fully embraced the temporary collapse of order in the name of divine appeasement. To understand the Egyptian mindset, one must embrace its duality. Ma'at, order, truth, balance, was perpetually threatened by Isfet, chaos, falsehood, disorder. The ultimate expression of this struggle was not a constant, sterile peace, but a cyclical reenactment where chaos was allowed, even encouraged, to erupt in a controlled, ritual context so that order could be dramatically reaffirmed. The Feast of Drunkenness was the apex of this ritual chaos. Centered on the worship of the goddess Hathor in her most dangerous and potent aspect, the festival had its roots in the myth of the destruction of mankind. In this story, the sun god Ra, grown old and facing rebellion from humanity, sent his Eye, the fierce lioness goddess Sekhmet, to slaughter them. Sekhmet reveled in the bloodshed, and Ra, fearing the complete annihilation of humanity, devised a trick. He had the gods flood the fields with beer dyed red with ochre. Sekhmet, mistaking it for blood, drank it, became intoxicated, fell asleep, and awoke transformed into the benevolent Hathor. Chaos was averted through ritual intoxication. This myth was reenacted annually in a festival dedicated to Hathor. It was not a secret, shameful orgy, but a major public religious event. The goal was communal intoxication to the point of experiencing the divine directly to reach a state where the boundary between human and goddess blurred to become the pacified Sekhmet Hathor. Participants drank heavily of specially brewed beer, likely sometimes laced with mandrake or other substances, in sacred spaces and private homes. Descriptions from texts and scenes on ostraca, pottery shards, and in some tombs show a festival of profound sensory overload. Music from sistra, drums, and clappers was relentless. Dancing was ecstatic and uninhibited. People drank, vomited, and drank again. They fell asleep in public and had vivid dreams interpreted as divine messages. There was a deliberate and sanctioned loosening of social bonds. The normal hierarchies of master and servant, man and woman, were temporarily suspended within the ritual frame. This could certainly lead to sexual activity that would be taboo in daily life. Scenes often labelled erotic in archaeology books may actually depict this ritual, carnivalesque context. However, to characterize the entire festival as a week-long orgy of violence and sexual chaos is a sensational misreading. The violence was primarily symbolic and mythic, the reenactment of Sekhmet's rage and its pacification. The sexual element, while present, was likely part of a broader atmosphere of fertility ritual and boundary dissolution, not the systematic, violent abuse described in the original script. The festival was a controlled release of Isfet. It had a prescribed time, place, and religious purpose to get so dangerously close to chaos, drunkenness, loss of control that the community could collectively pull back, re-embrace Ma'at, and ensure the goddess's favor for another year. It was catharsis, not collapse. Foreign diplomats, such as those from more stoic Mesopotamia, might indeed have been scandalized by the public drunkenness and revelry, seeing it as a lack of discipline. But for Egyptians, it was a vital religious duty. The economic cost of shutting down for days was an investment in cosmic and social stability, a price worth paying to keep Sekhmet at bay and ensure Hathor's blessings of fertility, joy, and music. The real turning point came not from internal moral revolution, but from external cultural collision. The Ptolemaic period, 305 to 30 BCE, following the conquests of Alexander the Great, placed Greek rulers on the Egyptian throne. The Ptolemies, to legitimize themselves, adopted the trappings of pharaohs and funded magnificent temples like Edfu and Dendera. But they brought with them a Hellenistic worldview that often struggled to reconcile with the deep, physical, and ecstatic nature of Egyptian ritual. Greek philosophy tended to separate the mind from the body, elevating rational thought and viewing uncontrolled ecstasy with suspicion. The Feast of Drunkenness, with its emphasis on collective loss of self through intoxication, was fundamentally alien to this sensibility. The later Roman worldview, with its emphasis on public morality, mos maiorum, and political order, found such practices even more distasteful and politically dangerous. Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh, was a masterful political operator navigating this clash. She was fully Greek by lineage, but presented herself as the Egyptian goddess Isis incarnate. She would have participated in traditional rituals to secure the loyalty of her Egyptian subjects, while simultaneously trying to frame her rule in terms that Roman power brokers like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony could understand and support. This was a tightrope walk. Privately, she may have observed rituals Romans would find bizarre, Publicly, she cultivated an image of regal, Hellenistic sovereignty. The pressure to moderate or hide the more extreme aspects of Egyptian ritual life grew under this external gaze. The systematic abuse suggested in the original script likely exaggerates a real phenomenon: the retreat of indigenous practices from public view under the judgmental eye of a foreign ruling class. Traditional rituals didn't vanish. They may have become more private, or their meaning slowly began to atrophy as the priestly class lost political power and grappled with foreign dominance. The final blow was the Roman conquest in 30 BCE. Emperor Augustus, having defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony, sought to bring Egypt firmly under Rome's bureaucratic and ideological control. The Romans were pragmatic about religion, often absorbing foreign gods into their pantheon. However, practices they deemed destabilizing or morally repugnant were suppressed. The Feast of Drunkenness, with its mass, ecstatic and hierarchy-inverting qualities, would have been seen as a potential seedbed for rebellion and a moral affront. While we have no evidence of a specific Roman decree banning it, the overall effect of Roman administration, combined with the growing influence of other religious movements, including early Christianity, which had a strong ascetic streak, would have pushed such practices to the margins and eventually into obscurity. The children raised within the temple systems faced an uncertain future as these institutions changed and declined under foreign rule. Their specialized skills in music, dance, and ritual became less relevant in a world where power spoke Latin and Greek. The complex, integrated worldview that gave meaning to their roles was fragmenting. This cultural dislocation, the loss of purpose and identity, is a profound trauma that historical records hint at, but rarely detail. The Roman era didn't just conquer Egypt politically. It began the long process of dismantling the ancient Egyptian mind, paving the way for a new world that would find the old ways not just foreign, but forbidden. The cover-up of ancient Egypt's more confronting aspects was not the work of ancient priests hiding secrets, but of modern scholars grappling with their own cultural baggage. The 19th century birth of scientific Egyptology coincided with the height of the Victorian era in Britain and Europe, a period defined by strict social codes, sexual repression, and a deep-seated Christian morality. Explorers and archaeologists like Giovanni Belzoni, Auguste Mariette, and Flinders Petrie were products of their time. When these men entered tombs and temples, they were not neutral observers. They were gentlemen and a few gentlewomen of an empire that saw itself as the pinnacle of civilization. Confronted with explicit imagery, statues of the god Min with an erect phallus, papyri depicting sexual acts, or tomb paintings showing revelry, they faced a cognitive dissonance. How could this great, sophisticated civilization, which they admired for its art, architecture, and apparent monotheistic tendencies under Akhenaten, also produce what they could only classify as pornography? Their reactions followed a pattern. The first was segregation. Objects deemed obscene were removed from public display and placed in secret cabinets or restricted museum storage. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo and the British Museum in London had such collections accessible only to serious, i.e. male, scholars. The famous Turin erotic papyrus, a satirical and possibly ritual document, was hidden away for decades. The second was censorship in publication. When documenting tomb walls, artists would often discreetly omit or alter explicit details in their published drawings. Translations of medical papyri, like the extensive gynecological sections of the Ebers papyrus, were bowdlerized, with euphemisms replacing direct terms. The full, unvarnished content only became available in the late 20th century. The third, and most destructive, was selective destruction. While not universally practiced, some figures admitted to it. Flinders Petrie, the father of systematic archaeology, wrote in a letter about fragments of indecorous pottery, "The less said about them the better. Many were broken. Wall paintings were sometimes selectively damaged to remove offending portions." This wasn't malicious. To the Victorian mind, it was a form of preservation of public morality and of Egypt's dignified legacy. This Victorian veil had profound consequences. It created the popular image of ancient Egypt as a death-obsessed, solemn, and mystically austere civilization. The vibrant, earthy, and holistic aspects of its culture, its celebration of life, fertility, and the body as part of the divine order, were stripped away. This sanitized version was easier to digest and fit neatly into Western narratives of progressive history where primitive excess gave way to civilized restraint. The legacy of this censorship persists. Major museum exhibits, even today, often shy away from explicit material or present it with such clinical detachment that its original cultural and ritual context is lost. Popular media tends to recycle the same tropes of treasure, curses, and solemn rituals, ignoring the complex humanity of the Egyptians. However, the tide has been slowly turning since the mid-20th century. The rise of social history, gender studies, and a more objective approach to archaeology has led scholars to re-examine the secret artifacts and censored texts. They are now understood not as pornography, but as valuable sources on medicine, the fertility tests and contraceptives in the medical papyri, on religious symbolism, the potent imagery of Min, on social satire, the Turin papyrus, and on the comprehensive Egyptian worldview that did not compartmentalize life into sacred and profane. The real shocking truth is not about hidden chambers of abuse, but about the breadth of human experience that the Egyptians documented and integrated into their cosmos. They confronted birth, death, sex, illness, and ecstasy with a directness that later cultures found uncomfortable. The Victorian cover-up was an attempt to make the past conform to present sensibilities. Modern Egyptology's task is to remove that veil, not to revel in sensationalism, but to see the civilization in all its brilliant, complicated, and authentically human detail. This journey into the less illuminated corners of ancient Egypt reveals a civilization far more complex than the monolithic, golden idol of popular imagination. It was a world where the embalmer's knife served both science and spirit, where the pharaoh's body was a locus of cosmic power, where social hierarchies were sanctified by divine order, and where chaos was ritually invoked to preserve balance. The shadows in the tombs are not just the absence of light, but the presence of aspects of life that every culture possesses but portrays differently. By looking past the Victorian veil, we don't see a depraved society, we see a profoundly human one, struggling with the same fundamental forces of power, faith, desire, and mortality that shape our world today. In their unflinching engagement with the totality of existence, the ancient Egyptians may have more to teach us about the human condition than we initially thought, if only we have the courage to look at their world without our own prejudices as a filter.